Rahmanir Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to Office Hours at a special time. I am an absent-minded professor, and the proof is that I got the date wrong. So instead of having Office Hours at our regular weekly time on Fridays, my guest, who I'm so happy to welcome in a moment, was very kind and generous to make time on the actual date I specified, which was today. So Monday, a special edition of Office Hours. We'll be talking about resisting melancholia, Arab culture and politics during the genocide with Nihal Aasar. Welcome to you, Nihal. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. Big fan of your work. I've been following the stuff you do for a while.
That's so kind, and likewise, just to tell the audience who may not be familiar, although I hope by the end of this stream they will all follow you and your work everywhere they can, that you are an Egyptian writer, a political analyst, radio host, DJ. You have a regular show, Nile to Bank, on NTS Radio, and your work has appeared in a number of great places, and we'll be talking about some of it. And you're based in London currently. And so people should go follow your work. We'll mention a few of the pieces. And at the end, I think I'll also ask you to tell listeners about where they can follow you further, both on social media and especially if you want to plug any upcoming work and so on. But, you know, I've been fascinated. I have a friend, Nouri Ghana, who wrote a book called Arab Melancholia, Arab cultural critique. I'm getting the subtitle incorrect, but I think it's cultural defeat and Arab cultural critique, I think is it. And so I had already been thinking a little bit about post-1967 Arab culture and politics through his book. And you published a piece not too long ago in the last year or so called Left-Wing Melancholia, the Arab political subject. And I feel like it sums up a lot of different strands of work that you've been doing and thinking. And so I thought maybe that's a great place to start, is about the overall kind of situation and what you mean by the Arab political subject, how you're kind of thinking through that, how it expresses itself. And this kind of left-wing melancholia, you know, as a frame, it sounds very sad. I think the situation is unbelievably tragic and grievous. And so I think that's where I want to start, is just during this genocide in particular. It seems that, you know, people are wrestling with an awful lot. And so how do you explain how you would really characterize the mood, the sentiment, and the kind of parameters of the Arab political subject in this moment?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned Nouri Ghana's book, because it's been one of the, you know, integral books that I've read that have inspired this piece that you mentioned that was published in Parapraxis. That alongside Hannah Proctor's book Burnout, a number of other books. And it's funny because I mentioned to Nouri, I've messaged him and I've said, you know, while I was reading this book, it's almost as if like he's thinking exactly the same things I'm thinking, using the exact same examples. Like he uses Yusuf Shaheen's The Sparrow. He talks about Naguib Mahfouz's work in post-67, The Dog and the Thieves, all stuff that I've been reading and watching while thinking about, you know, the Arab streets and the Arab masses around the genocide. And what I wasn't like really thinking about writing this piece, but I was, you know, in recent, like since the genocide, like people, like a lot of people have talked about the genocide itself from Gaza or from outside. People have talked about the axis of resistance, the Gulf, but I felt what was missing, at least from my positionality as an Egyptian who was born and raised in Egypt, who lived through, my political awakening was kind of the 2011, the Arab Spring moment. And I was thinking about my positionality as an Egyptian, about where the Arab streets are or where the Arab masses are. So my thinking about this piece was, kind of this analysis around the genocide. And what I found, like, obviously, as much as it's really, like, disappointing is an understatement. Like, it's really unacceptable that, the Arab streets, to which Palestine has always been the cause, or the center of the Arab cause, hasn't moved, when it's arguably the deadliest moment that we've seen, from the Nakba to the Naksa. Like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands potentially killed, like an entire city, Gaza, like the city, like the city of resistance. Its infrastructure leveled, children killed, hospitals bombed, schools bombed, cultural institutions. And this hasn't elicited a response from the streets that has been elicited by moments like the Intifada or even prior bombardments. And that got me thinking about how the analysis or lack of analysis is actually insufficient, because for me, at least, I don't like, it's not satisfying to say, oh, the Ummah is dead. Oh, like, whoa, the Arabs. You know what I mean? It's not, that's kind of demobilizing for me, especially as we still think of, like, Palestine as an Arab cause. And I'll get to that. I'll get to why I think that in a bit. Um, and I was thinking about how Palestinian intellectual, Munir Shafiq, who was born in 1936, and who keeps focusing on the Arab dimension until now, even. And he said in an article that was recently written after the genocide, like in the few months after the genocide, and he said, if the Arabs were as apathetic and as lazy and as stupid, or as, deplorable as the satirists say they are, then why do they need that much repression? If they're really that useless, or they've stopped caring about Palestine, or they're focusing on individual issues, then why do they need the most repressive Western-backed regimes in the world to suppress them? And that's got me thinking about how defeat is not merely like a psychological affect. Defeat is actually material as well. And you can marry those two things at the same time. Like, when we, because I know there's a trend in academia. I don't have a PhD and I'm not an academic, but I have a lot of friends who are academics. But there is a trend and a push to kind of like, study affect, or think about affect. And it made me think about how defeat, and like left-wing melancholia in that sense, it's referring to Enzo Traverso's left-wing melancholia, which talks about how kind of, to borrow from Perry Anderson, like, defeat is the hallmark of the Western left. And, as much as like it was really interesting to read Traverso's book, but it, like, when he talks about the fall of the Soviet Union or the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of these dates, I found that one glaring date that was missing. Like, people jump straight from, end of the World War to 1968, and outside of Arab literature, no one really thinks of 1967 as a world event. So my thinking around this piece was to, explain the defeat of the Arab streets, to position, defeat against Israel as one of the defining moments of the defeat for the Arab left, and to seriously consider this issue of the Arab masses without satire. Yeah. Adnan, you're muted, I think.
Sorry, that is such a great point about the importance of rethinking the qualities and characteristics of defeat. That statement that it really is a hallmark of the Western left just reminds me of a piece that I'm very fond of thinking about and returning to that appeared in Black Agenda Report a few years ago by Manolo de los Santos, who it was about like how purity and martyrdom are the obsessions of the Western left rather than actual resistance and trying to take power. That they'd rather be martyrs and they'd rather have purity, and that it really was a kind of Christian leftism. It was, even though it may be secular, but nonetheless, the cultural conditions and motifs and structures, you might say, and logics of the culture of martyrdom and sacrifice, and like it's the process of suffering itself, that we're struggling and we're suffering, but we're right, like that's what's more important than actually social transformation or learning how to take over politics, the political sphere. Just reminds me that is that is something that has characterized Western Marxism and Western leftism. And it's interesting to think in this context with you about how and why defeat might operate within the Arab world and what might be the differences in how it could seed something different. And I think this idea that 1967 is a world historical event is really important. I mean, if we think about what's happening in Gaza right now, I've been saying that this is basically a world historical event taking place right now, and that the world will never be the same. And in fact, there isn't even something that I would call post-Gaza, as if Gaza will be finished, because what will happen is the processes by which the world will be organized, repression will be globalized, is something that will continue and move to other populations, because the model of how you can liquidate surplus populations, destroy them, genocide them with impunity, if that happens, will basically be the crucible in which our future. So we're fighting for basically the future on a grand world historical scale, and that's one way to see the resistance as operating within a world historical paradigm, where if we want a livable, sustainable, equitable future, we have to support the Palestinian resistance to defeat this model. But something you said that I want to come back to and ask you further about is about the repression, because I think it's interesting. It's a very interesting observation. If the Arabs were useless, and that's what's being said all the time. Where are the Arabs? Wayne al-Arab, why aren't they? And even George Abdullah, and I really respect George Abdullah's approach. And I think if you asked him in his analysis, he would explain that because of these corrupt comprador regimes that are repressing, Arab populations. But he did sort of call out in the first interview upon his arrival to Lebanon after 40 odd years of incarceration in France and Europe. He said, we need Egypt. Like, why not have the masses of Egypt? If like 1 million or 2 million of you march to Gaza, this is all over, kind of thing. So how to think through that situation where, and how you're thinking through that. I'd be very curious to see you elaborate your analysis about the nature of the repression and thus the character of the politics in the Arab world right now.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you mentioned the George Abdullah example, and I don't think there's a contradiction, because what he did in his first 2 interviews was highlight the centrality of the Arab masses, especially Egypt, because it's 120 million and because of other reasons. But he mentions, he specifically says for the Arab masses to take the streets, and then he says for the Egyptian masses to take the streets 3 times in a row. Mm-hmm. And then in another interview, he calls on like millions of Egyptian masses to take the streets. And there's this recognition, especially if you're in a kind of older generation that saw the Pan-Arab Project and the Arab Socialist Project, you'll see that, alongside Iran, Egypt was the only other like true national liberation project in the region. And there's this recognition that without something changing in this country, like there lies the key of maybe opening up further avenues of resistance. And I'm actually writing another piece right now, or I'm in the process of editing it, that could be seen as a part 2 of the piece, the Arab political subject piece. It's a long one, it's 10,000 words, but it's about kind of like the fall of the Camp David Accords. And, when Camp David was, okay, let's go back a step further. We say that 1967 was the big defeat, right? But some people argue, historian Khalid Fahmy, for example, Egyptian historian, whose work on this period is quite essential, in my opinion. So
former colleague of mine at NYU, I will say so. I know Khalid from way back, but so I'm interested. Please continue.
Yeah, so he's an amazing historian. Like, he taught me at the American University in Cairo back during the Egyptian Revolution. He mentions this, and he says the defeat happened in 1967 and it was resounding. And all of these things that we talk about all the time, that I talk about how it kind of thrust the Arab world outside of the left, and kind of it was like the kind of our Berlin Wall, or our fall of the Soviet Union before socialism was defeated globally. And it was the moment the US saw the utility in Israel being its watchdog in the region, and fully supported the project, gave it full-fledged support after that moment, because it saw that it could do its dirty work for it while it was busy doing other, in Vietnam. And it could see that Israel not only defeated the Arab armies militarily, but in essence also defeated the Pan-Arab and socialist project. And it wasn't only like a fight against communism or Soviet influenced communism. The US at that point saw Nasser's project, even though a lot of people in the region call it like a state capitalist project, but it still saw it as the Pan-Arab project as threatening as communism. So with this defeat, it saw that Israel could do its dirty work for it in the region. And yeah, with all of this background in mind, Khaled Fahmy argues that the defeat didn't really happen in 67.
Yeah.
Because what happened then, and that's not where the story ends and people move on, and the people who say that Nasser lost every war he entered and all of that, forget that something very crucial happened in the next in the next 3 years until Nasser died in 1970. So immediately after the 67 defeat, Nasser resigned, in one of the most incredible speeches that Mohammed Hassanein Heikel, his speechwriter and confidant, wrote for him. And, I encourage people to view the speech if they haven't. And what happened immediately after is that the Egyptian people pour into the streets and call for Nasser to stay. And it's, a lot of analysts say, oh, like the Arab people love their despots, or it's Stockholm syndrome, or, oh, these protests, which is like hundreds of thousands, were all staged. They told people to go into the streets. And, even let's say that some of it was staged, I don't think you can mobilize hundreds of thousands that quickly. People weren't really asking for Nasser to stay for Nasser himself. The calls from the street were, we're gonna fight. And it was this recognition when Nasser says that he was gonna step down, that Nasser's deputy that he mentioned would have been someone who would immediately ally with the US camp and call for, a peace process. So it was a rejection of that. And there's this very famous scene from Despair, the film I mentioned about the defeat, where this one of the characters of this film, Bahia, who's supposed to represent Egypt, calls in the streets, "Hanharib, Hanharib," means we will fight, we will fight. And it is a manifestation from the Egyptian people that they still wanted to fight Israel. They didn't want to settle. They, despite the loss, where like Egypt lost 85% of its air force, people still wanted to continue armed resistance against Israel. And what happens is Nasser goes back to his post, and 3 weeks later, Egypt launches the war of attrition, which lasts for 3 years, which essentially was a war in which Nasser knew he wouldn't regain back the land, but wanted to restructure the Egyptian military. Wanted to not give Israel like the kind of satisfaction in its win by continuing its armed combat against it, and to regain the Egyptian military's confidence, all of which he managed to do, and all of which, like Nasserists would argue, this is the army that won the first 1973 battle. It's not Anwar Sadat's army, it's not Anwar Sadat's win, it's actually Nasser's army that he built in the war of attrition. And a testament to that is Moshe Dayan saying after 1967 that he was confidently waiting next to the telephone for Nasser to ring him and offer and call for a settlement, a call which never happened. So the defeat didn't actually come in 1967. The defeat came in 1978 with the Camp David Accords.
Yeah, that's very interesting reframing of the history. And of course, if one frames it that way, defeat is not the outcome of resistance. Mm-hmm. It never is. Mm-hmm. Because you can't be defeated if you continue to resist. And there's something very important about that. Defeat came with surrender. So Egypt's decision under Sadat to conclude the Camp David Accords, which is, of course, hailed in the West, right, as such an important peace agreement. Of course, it was geostrategically. It took the largest military force that could challenge Israel in the region out of the game, right? So that's a really interesting way to think about what is the source of defeat in this context. Is this how people, typically? I mean, when Khalid Fahmy, makes this argument, is this something that resonates with people, or what is the way in which? And we had a question here from T. Suggs that, speaking of 67, how does the Arab street, well, let's just say popular Arab political kind of consciousness and opinion, remember Nasserism, asking as a potential way to combat the melancholia? And I think that gets to the point about what is the source of defeat. So how is this kind of framed and understood? How does it operate within the Arab political subject, the memory of this?
Yeah, so funnily enough, last year when I was at Historical Materialism conference here in London, there was this panel on US foreign policy in the region. And one of the panelists says, like, offhandedly in a passing manner, is like, oh, Nasser is irrelevant now. No one talks about Nasser anymore. And I remember my jaw just dropping, because in my mind, I was like, what are you talking about? Like, in Egypt and in the Arab world, there's constant Nasser discourse. Like, it never stops. It's as if he's still president. It's like, especially in these conditions. And yesterday, actually, was the 55th anniversary of Nasser's death, which coincides with like a day after Nasrallah's death, and the first day that Black September happened in Jordan. So that's why, like, truly, they call it truly a Black September. And yesterday, if we take yesterday as an example, whether you love Nasser or hate Nasser, the the Nasser question was never resolved. And it's not about Nasser himself, it's about the project that Nasser was the figurehead to, a project that, even critics of Nasser would say is the only truly hegemonic project in Egypt's modern history, because it had so much support from millions in the country, and including figures on the left that Nasser imprisoned, like Sana'allah Ibrahim, the novelist who just passed away, who was imprisoned in Nasser's prisons, but refused to critique him afterwards, or supported his project actually. And one example of which, he wrote a novel called 67, and he refused to publish it after Nasser's death for fear it would be used by the right, especially as there were a lot of anti-left repression by the government, and it was only published after 2011. Another example is poet Abdurrahman al-Abnoudi, who said, even despite Nasser imprisoning him, saying that he had never cried in his life the way Nasser died. And this is not like we're materialists here. This is not like a big man theory of history here, but it's about this project that Nasser was the figurehead of, that, some people call it a defeated project, but what I feel it is an unfinished project, which is why it draws that much attention until now from both its supporters and its haters and its critics. Like the Saudi channel Al Arabiya keeps trying to slander Nasser and say that has leaked voice memos of Nasser's that try to show him as a normalizer, or try to show him as a kind of Sisi-like figure. And until now, Saudi Arabia hasn't gotten over him as well, or the Gulf monarchies haven't gotten over him, and it's because this project, there's still questions around this project and about this phase in Arab history, this episode. And if we were to think about, you alluded to it before, but this kind of theory of accumulation, there's a reason why people posted Nasser and Nasrallah's pictures together yesterday as a kind of continuation of this regional project of national liberation against Israel in the region. And there's this someone shared this clip actually of a Muslim Brotherhood channel from Egypt interviewing a leader from Hamas, and bringing up Nasser, expecting the leader from Hamas to critique him or talk badly about him, and he says nothing but good things about Nasser, and then the interviewer is quite surprised. So there's this kind of on the Egyptian streets as well. So I'm going to generalize a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, but amongst the kind of generation that it's a bit older than me, that were the kind of revolutionaries of Tahrir Square, obviously there were thousands, if not millions. So there's very differences, but there's this sentiment that if we're fighting against authoritarianism, then it's the July state that Nasser built that laid the groundwork for this authoritarianism. So if through an anti-authoritarian lens, then you would place the blame there. But the newer generation, the generation that's kind of 25 years and under, I'm seeing a lot of resurgence in Nasser's popularity. And I think there's a recognition here that sovereignty, the lens of sovereignty, is as important, if not more important, than the lens of anti-authoritarianism, especially seeing what the current Egyptian government is doing or not doing right now, or doesn't have the capability to do. So it's back to the contradictions are really sharpening, in a sense that youth are seeing, well, wait a minute, there was one period of Egypt's history which was a bit different than the others. And why is that? It's because of sovereignty. And yeah, with the Camp David Accords, it was, which was a Henry Kissinger project. The project was to kind of find individual solutions for individual countries, and the first country that had to be taken out of the equation, obviously, was the country that most existentially threatened Israel, which was Egypt with its military. So an individual solution was found for Egypt, and people seriously thought at the time, well, we've tried armed resistance. Maybe let's try something else. Maybe if we give them this concession, maybe if the biggest army in the region steps out, then Israel would feel less threatened and it would be less murderous. But what we see, the first thing that happened after the signing of the Camp David Accords was that Israel went on to invade Beirut a couple of years later. And it's kind of as if to say, we've neutralized you, like, on to the next big Arab capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many interesting threads and connections to consider, in those remarks. And I think that is, you've really expressed, I think, the crux of the matter, which is that there was one major project of sovereignty in the region, in that part of West Asia, in the post-colonial era, in order to be able to pursue, development, sovereign development. I mean, and I don't mean that in just like a progressive, linear sort of way, but like to meet the needs of the people of the region. There was one major project that was designed, whatever its mistakes and limitations, and you could argue, there have been the high dam, maybe it would have been better. These are kind of immaterial because wasn't allowed to be a normal country making its own decisions about how it wanted to invest its resources for the advancement of, the welfare of its own people. I mean, so basically it comes down to Nasserism was a project of sovereignty in the region, and that had to be derailed. And it's so fascinating to watch the media, as you've been pointing out, like Al Arabiya and these other channels that are sponsored by the Gulf monarchies, who were, of course, on the completely opposite side during what was sometimes called the Arab Cold War, right? Like between the, socialistic Republican ideals that Nasserism and variants represented, and these corrupt Gulf monarchies that were aligned completely with the West. So I think that's a very important point that you raised there. I am fascinated by these Nasser, Nasrallah kind of posters. And the surprise, it clearly shows that the interviewer doesn't understand that this is essentially what's at stake. It's not about religious identity alone as somehow, because these Gulf monarchies have in the past portrayed and characterized themselves very much within the religious frame as a conservative counterpoint to leftist movement politics, right? But that doesn't make sense if you see the resistance as, it may be that they choose the frame of religion as the basis for marshaling and mobilizing and defending, a resistance movement. But what they're after is sovereignty. It is this advancement. So to be surprised that this Hamas leader has nothing bad to say about Nasser, it just shows that they don't really understand the terms of their own capitulation, in this frame. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. Do you see somebody like Nasrallah, who actually was demonized? I remember in 2006 when Israel invaded southern Lebanon after, it had been, ejected in 2000. So a mere 6 years later, they wanted to try and restore their hegemonic control over the South and occupation. and retake that, control of that part of southern Lebanon. And there was so much propaganda against the incredibly morale boosting resistance of Hezbollah. Not only did they eject the Israelis, but they defended against this attempt to retake it in dramatic fashion. And I remember that the invasion of southern Lebanon happened again because of a bombardment in Gaza. I remember Huda, was it Huda Ghalia? I think her name was. Her whole family was killed on the beach in Gaza in the summer in 2006. I was in Palestine at the time in the West Bank. So I remember the news about this very vividly. And then the war started because Hezbollah actually intervened on the side of defending Palestinians against this attack. Do you think of Nasrallah, or how is Nasrallah? Because it really bothers me to see this demonization. There's a very sectarian attempt to try and use sectarian ideology of this, Sunni antipathy or fears about Shi'is as merely, proxies of Iran that they look at as very nefarious, forgetting that, nobody understands or remembers history. I don't expect them to, but Iran was not like Shi'i until the 16th century. The leaders of Shi'is were always southern Iraqis and people in southern Lebanon. I mean, that's the people who built the intellectual foundations for Shi'i theology, Shi'i law, all this stuff. But for some reason, they've been kind of portrayed and characterized now in the sectarian logic as somehow outsiders that don't belong, and they're almost as if they're foreigners. And so, I'm just wondering, how is Nasrallah, his anniversary of his death just happened, as you were alluding to. How is he looked at, and how do you see his position as a figure and an emblem from a more materialist analysis of resistance that carries on this project of sovereignty? And how do people reconcile and think through the difference between a secular seeming leader in Nasser and a religious cleric like Nasrallah, but yet they could both be figures of sovereign resistance?
Yeah, so when I mentioned the younger generation that were in Egypt, where we're seeing a resurgence of interest in Nasser, there's also the same interest in the resistance project in Lebanon and in Nasrallah in the same way. And again, that's, if we use the lens of sovereignty, this is the lens that we're looking at. In 2006, actually, Nasrallah had a huge popularity, and Hezbollah had huge popularity in Egypt. There's pictures from the African Cup of Nations in Egypt that was hosted in Egypt that year, the year after, where people in the stands were holding pictures of Nasrallah and the Hezbollah flag. In the years that followed, obviously the biggest controversy, the biggest division in kind of Arab unity happened, which was the kind of the Syrian civil war, right? And that's when things started to diverge a bit. There were some people in in the Arab Spring who were part of the 2011 revolution, who saw in the Syrian revolution, in what happened in Syria, saw Egypt in what happened in Syria, which is what created a lot of emotive responses about Syria and made it this topic that no one can talk about without accusations getting hurled at you from, whatever side. But, with after Syria fell recently, people have been have started, and after the recent developments, after we've seen Israeli tanks in the countryside of Damascus. We've seen the Israeli infringement in Syria. We've seen the new Syrian government seek to normalize relations with Israel and on the route to that in Israel. So there's people who are starting to think about, wait, did we miscalculate Syria? Were the people who were saying there was an American plan for Syria, like, were they right? There's calculations and reconsiderations about Hezbollah's intervention in Syria. And again, that opens up a lot of ways to think about these projects and kind of like reconsiderations. That's why we're saying the contradictions are sharpening, because what's happening is really elucidating a lot of the things that were mystified in the years in the past decade, basically. And like, this is something that I think people in the West miss when they think about figures like Nasser, Nasrallah, or how Arabs conceive of what's happening now, or like how these projects are. Like, people in the region and do not think of the Palestinian cause as a cause in solidarity. They think of it as, we think of it as our cause. Like, that's something that I'm not in solidarity with.
Mm-hmm.
That is my project, the same way it is the project of any Palestinian. And it's not, if we go back to culture and we look at most of the Egyptian films that have Israel in it, most of them hardly mention Palestine at all. It's like almost the Egyptian relation to Israel, like Egypt's wars with Israel. It's a kind of like acknowledgement that the presence of Israel in the region negatively affects, and that's the understatement of the year, every single country that surrounds it. And that's something that's really missing from the discourse. And we've seen in the last, after the 67 loss, after Camp David Accords, the kind of like narrowization of the Palestinian cause from being an Arab cause to like a Palestinian only cause, to now we're seeing that, the Gaza solution, the West Bank solution, it's even being narrowed,
fragmented further. Yes.
Fragmented further, that even, and it's also because like what Israel's doing in Gaza right now, the genocide that it's doing, is creating these divisions further, even within people in Palestine themselves. Like, people in Gaza have the right to say, we've had a different experience as being Palestinians than people in Ramallah, for example. And that's by design.
That's right. So,
but people like, when we see Westerners talk about, oh, those useless Egyptians or whatever, I'm like, these Egyptians are victims of Zionism and imperialism, the same way as Palestinians are, maybe not in the same brutal, like they're not facing the sharpest end of imperialism through genocide, through eradication as in Gaza, but they're facing it through impoverishment, through repression, through defeat, through de-development, through loss of potential, through a lot of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, I think, important analysis to put it in our more regional context. Before going on, I've been so absorbed in the conversation and what you've been saying that I've neglected to tell listeners and watchers that you're not going to get this kind of analysis and insight and knowledge everywhere. And don't be parsimonious and miserly with this opportunity. Like the stream so that it'll be boosted in the algorithm. Share it on your social media. It's streaming right now on X, Twitter. You can retweet it and make sure more of the people you know and care about, your comrades, your colleagues, your friends, can hear about it, and they can have the benefit of joining in the discussion and learning as well from all the great insights that Nihal is sharing with us. And if you like to support this channel, you can go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein or make a one-time contribution, buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Hussein. We really appreciate it. But I would rather you make a donation to somebody you could help in Gaza. There's so many appeals out there online. And I also need to announce, and I will, of course, come back at the end and announce this as well. I need to announce that tomorrow we will be having a special live stream discussion, Break the Siege of Complicity, with a number of my friends and colleagues in this space to do have a fundraiser for the Samir Project. Because as much as we may be interested in supporting and helping the individuals we come across, we need collective solutions as well. And the Samir Project is a Palestinian-led mutual aid organization working in Gaza that attempts to distribute food, provide shelter and support, but also, very importantly, invests in small-scale but absolutely necessary infrastructure projects like water, making sure that water can be drawn from wells and distributed, things that will help the Palestinian people resisting in Gaza continue to be Samidun and stay on their land. So I just want you all to know, 11 a.m. tomorrow, that's Eastern time, we'll be having a fundraiser, and I want to invite everybody on this stream to join again tomorrow. So Nihal, getting back to, you mentioned now just a slightly lighter thing, just because I am a big football fan. You did mention the Africa Cup of Nations. In your previous account during 2006, it was hosted in Egypt, and that kind of entered into the political environment culturally, because direct politics in the repression as a consequence of U.S. supported and backed dictators that stifle other forms of politics, that very often culture is a way of expressing this kind of deeper political dissatisfaction with the state of the world and the identification with the struggle in the region against colonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, not just in solidarity, as you're pointing out, with Palestinians, but in order to free the region as a whole from this. And we should mention, like, why is it that this region, if it wasn't a problem, why is it that this region has been subjected to war after war, for decades upon decades, not only, through the, Zionist entity, but direct U.S. military operation? Why do they have to have, bases littered across the entire, Southwest Asia and North Africa if, it wasn't a political problem that had to be controlled? So, that's the point. But because it is being suppressed, and because there is essentially a military occupation of many Arab countries, either through a kind of dictator who's sponsored with a lot of military aid and support and training, or, because there are actual U.S. military bases right there, politics has to express itself in a different way through culture, but also in sport. And so I wanted to talk a little. You had a really wonderful piece about Al Ahly Football Club, which I discovered you are a supporter of, and that you were telling me that it's right now, or it's very recently, the derby, the Cairo derby between two of the major clubs of Cairo, Al Ahly and Zamalek, and that this means something more than just a local Cairo football derby. I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us a little bit about the way, as an illustration of the way in which contemporary Arab culture, especially in a place like Egypt, is suffused with, the politics that can't be spoken in other ways.
So football is really like a really, really important arena in Egypt historically, right? And through football, you can explain a lot about what's happened in Egypt through the last 15 years or more. And you can write a book about like Egyptian history through football. And
you should write that. That would be a great book.
I mean, have a list of projects. I hope they don't end up in a graveyard sometime. But yeah, but when thinking about this piece, it's because there was a really interesting experiment that has to be seen as part of the social and political movements that led up to 2011, and then the repression, the counter-revolution that happened after in the state of Egypt now. So some personal history. I was, at the time in 2007, 2008, I was a tennis player for Ahli. So I was paid to be a tennis player, like a semi-professional tennis player. And at the time, the ultras phenomena was starting to make its way to Egypt. So, football fan associations started forming, but specifically in the ultras form, which, is prevalent around Europe. And when people think of the ultras in Europe, they think of thugs or hooligans, or like even fans that hold, when you think about England, for example, that hold like more right-wing ideologies. But, that was not the case in Egypt. The ultras, what I tried to explain in the piece, it didn't start out as political at all. The only there was a political project, even though the members themselves don't say there was. But the political project was to reclaim a space and take ownership of a space within Egypt, which is quite interesting, because if you think about Egypt, there's not a lot, especially in Cairo, there's not a lot of access to public spaces. There's not a lot of public parks. People don't really congregate. It's one of the most surveilled countries in the world, and that's even from Mubarak's era. So the Ultras project was to basically bring football from being a tool within which the state or the Egyptian government can, use as a source of national pride or distraction, and bring it back to the fans, and, have the fans control and manage the stadium. And even that, project that was focused only on football and didn't have any ambitions to go outside of the stadium, that was already, like, from inception, a kind of statement that for the state, that it was going to create conflict. Like, how is it that you not only want to organize yourself as young men, but you want to control a space? And from the beginning, there were clashes with the state, and through these clashes, the antagonism with the police started. And from there, we see from 2007, 2008 to 2011, the ultras start gaining popularity. They start, taking control of the stadiums. They start formulating really, really close ties and communal bonds, and really reclaiming a space in Egypt as their own, and bringing football, trying to bring football to the fans. And then what we see happen in 2011, when the uprisings start, and that was also, like, you could see that as part of other forms of organizing that was happening across the country. Like, that was also the time when workers were starting to organize. There was like a few workers issues, like there were people organizing around Palestine. So it was a time of, like, Egyptians organizing in the lead up to 2011. But because of the kind of like lack of political organizing, because of repression from the state, and the state not allowing political parties, or real political parties, not sham political parties, to exist, the ultras were one of the most organized, whether it's the ultras Ahlawi or the ultras White Knight, which is the Zamalek, the rivals. They're some of the most organized groups. So when 2011 happened, even though they released a statement, both groups, to that they were not going to participate, but the members of the group went individually as members to the square, and by virtue of their brotherhood and their communal ties that they've built over the years, they congregated as a group there, just because, as individuals, and because they were seasoned in interactions with the authorities and with the police, people started following them and started seeking their protection, and they started organizing the square, organizing the chants, organizing the streets, just because they had the knowledge and the ecosystem to do so, that the state started viewing them as a real threat that they had to get rid of. And that led in 2012 to, one of the most harrowing massacres of the of the time, at the time, the 2012 Port Said massacre, where 72 Ahli fans were killed in Port Said under really suspicious circumstances. And eventually after that, the ultras really took to the squares to the square after, to try and get justice for the 72 who died, and the 2 who died in Tahrir Square separately, so 74 in total. And they really became a force, and they were the only group that was actually able to become rivals to the police and to the state authority. They were, a lot of things were attributed to them, including, burning police cars, doing sit-ins in the street. And when we talk about sit-ins in Egypt, it's not sit-ins like in the West. Like the it's not like a polite sit. Like, it's really disruptive. And this all led to their disbanding as a terrorist organization in 2018. And there's a lot to the story, of course, and if you want, if you read the story, there's a lot more details to be said. But it's a testament to, it speaks to the fact that organizing in Egypt is so dangerous and threatening, not only to the state but to the regional order as a whole. That any form of organizing, including in football associations, is forbidden. Like, you're not even allowed to stake a claim in the football stadium. Like, there can't be an arena in the country that the security forces don't have control over. And if you think about the case of Egypt, it's actually wild to think, like, 120 million people, like, we have to be organized. We have to be organized. But the state's, raison d'etre has been to stop any form of organizing from, since the current regime took power in 2014 until now, to a really accelerating degree. Like, it was the case before, but at least before there was a semblance of civil society. There was some kind of like back and forth. Now all of civil society, as much as we critique civil society as the kind of like, what it is, it's been obliterated completely, and the state micromanages every single I don't think people realize how much organizing is forbidden in Egypt. There was you can't even organize as a neighborhood committee. Like, there was a neighborhood committee that formed in Alexandria a few months ago to protest the building of a ring road or a bridge, and we know how much infrastructure building has been accelerating in Egypt, to protest the building of a ring road in the neighborhood that was going to have really bad effects on pedestrian areas, on the area itself. And the spokesperson of this committee has been arrested just for protesting a ring road being built. My friends who go to Cairo University say it's a completely militarized zone. Like, there are soldiers there who are asking students to form a line. Like, the security officers in Cairo University are the ones that handle everything. Like, everyone who goes on a scholarship, their name has to go to the security official. Everyone who goes to a conference, their name has to go through a security official. The extent to which like citizens are micromanaged and are seen as not even a burden but a threat to the state, is incredible. Really, the not a lot of people talk about this, but also there was a recent article that came out about the security checkpoints across Egypt, like in Cairo, outside of Cairo, most notably in Sinai, of course, which is considered a black box for a lot of Egyptians. A lot of Egyptians can't go to Sinai; they're prevented to go without reason. And if the only relationship a state has to its citizens is repression, nothing else, like no open lines of communication, no understanding, then it's an occupation authority. Like you can't say anything else about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, when you were describing these sort of parapolitical practices of football supporter groups and how they could be converted to actual political practices as a structure in society, it really reminded me actually of a deep history of these kind of young men organizations like Futuwa, groups from medieval Cairo, where the neighborhood kind of organization where they would meet together and maybe do wrestling or boxing or something like that. And yet these could be and they were, very dispersed and integral in the fabric of society and the social relations that they form, just as you were saying, the sense of brotherhood because you're part of this kind of common cause. It's very similar maybe to the way Sufi Turuk, used to, the Sufi brotherhoods also used to be organized as something that's outside of what we think of as normal politics and power, but wielded a lot of social power because of the social bonds and social relationships and how these were seen as dangerous. They had to be surveilled, they had to be recruited when you could recruit them. And so it just was really fascinating to kind of hear how, in a way, football fan supporter groups were something like, these Futuwa groups. There's a little bit of an analogy, with them. But I wanted to kind of also continue the analysis with how this is a connection between Egyptian kind of sporting culture and Gaza. Offline, you were telling me that this recent derby between Zamalek and Al Ahli, had repercussions and expressed kind of different ways of relating or thinking about the regional integration, which is something you had emphasized before about the connections between the cause of Palestine and a broader Arab, kind of regional cause. What's the relationship between Gaza and Egypt, when it comes through this lens of culture and sport?
Yeah, so, Gazan culture is really similar to Egyptian culture. And when we talk about, the city of Rafah, there's no Egyptian Rafah and Palestinian Rafah. There's supposed to be one Rafah. And there's this interesting Al Jazeera documentary called Which Rafah Do You Belong To? But it's really like one Rafah with families from both ends intermarrying. And like beyond that, Gaza was under Egyptian administration for the longest time. People in Gaza support the Egyptian football teams. They support the Egyptian national football team. I was just mentioning that today, like there's pictures emerging out of Gaza, showing people in Gaza watching the Cairo derby, Ahli and Zamalek, watching that over Trump's speech. And obviously, like, all of this makes this even more tragic because, when we look at recent history, people in Gaza supported the 2011 revolution. There's pictures of people in Gaza supporting Egypt reaching the World Cup in 2018. So the ties are really there. Like there's pictures of resistance fighters conducting operations against Israeli tanks wearing Egyptian football jerseys or like Zamalek football jerseys. Um, like they listen to the same music, mahraganat. They cook molokhia, like the
Egyptian way.
dish, the Egyptian way, not the Levantine way. Like I'm
Mhm.
saying this like this might sound a bit trivial now in the context of a genocide, but it's really crucial to understand that, like people in Egypt see people in Gaza as their siblings, as kin. And there's also jokes in Palestine about how, jokingly, other Palestinians say to people in Gaza, "Oh, when Palestine is liberated, you guys can go to Egypt. It's fine. Like Egypt can take you." um, but this is like we laugh about this, but this makes it so tragic that Egypt now can't do the bare minimum, like even the bare minimum that was being done under Mubarak. Under Mubarak, obviously we're not supporters of Mubarak at all, but there was kind of like a bare minimum. Like when any bombardment of Gaza would happen, like there would be delegations of Egyptian doctors going into the Gaza Strip immediately. Like the wounded would be taken out, and they would go to hospitals. They would allow, if not Egyptian, but foreign delegations, like the delegations that have been shut down in Egypt now over the past 2 years, over and over and over again. They would be allowed to go in. Sheikh al-Azhar would be allowed to go to Rafah. Like all of these things, even as symbolic, these are things that are not happening now at all. And whether it's, the two scenarios of why this is happening, whether it's like a complete lack of sovereignty or a choice to take normalization a step further, these are really alarming developments. And it kind of like, when Sisi makes all of these deplorable speeches that he does, when he says, you guys are complaining about hunger, talking to Egyptians, and but you're complaining about hunger, but we can't even get food and water to your neighbors. And you're shocked by this statement, but this statement is kind of like a warning to the Egyptian people. Like if you choose to resist the crumbs you're given, or choose the choice of resistance, then your fate can be the same, right? It's kind of like a fear. And it goes back to what you're saying, and how October 7th is a world historic event, and what this genocide is doing is a world historic event, and that it completely changed the balance, like the formula, that it sharpened the contradictions, it changed the formula, it made the comprador regimes more worried about what the results of that would be like. We saw people protesting in front of the Egyptian embassies. We saw activists try to go to Egypt to try and break the siege. All of these things that the Egyptian state had to confront, that it didn't want to confront. We learned about the presence of really worrying militias that control Sinai and the border, and are taking exorbitant amounts of money from Gazans entering Egypt, which has raised questions in Egypt around why is there an organized militia running Sinai and not the Egyptian army. And some people have even said that there's even divisions within the Egyptian army itself about some older, like the older part, the more traditional part of the military, thinking, oh, we've been loyal, we've done all of this, and you're rewarding these people outside of the military apparatus with positions and money, and the running of Sinai. So and it's making Egypt think about all of these things. Like, for example, after Israel bombed Qatar, what would happen in the case that Israel decides to, obviously, like, the bombing Egypt would be another completely, like, further escalation, because it would disrupt the Camp David order completely, and it would open up new avenues. But that made it like, that's, since Qatar has been bombed, at least optically, relations have soured more and more between Egypt and Israel. And it's also raised the question about what if forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza happens in Egypt, something that we know Sisi and the Egyptian state does not want at all. Like even the Palestinians that are in Gaza now that have paid thousands from Gaza that are in Egypt right now that have paid thousands and thousands of pounds to enter Egypt of their own money. Like the Egyptian state does not want to give them the same visas that it gave, for example, Syrian and Sudanese refugees who are able to live, work, and enroll their kids in schools in Egypt, and Gazans are not able to do the same. Because it's a recognition of, it's not only fear of what the Gazans in Egypt might do, but it's a fear of what political possibilities this might, this might have an effect on Egyptian opposition, basically. And if another front would open in Egypt as a result. So that's why the Egyptian state is so vehemently opposing the displacement. It's not out of, its love for the Egyptian people. It's out of a real legitimate fear of what this could mean to its legitimacy. So all of these questions it has to confront right now that it did not want to confront. And yeah, it's a testament to and a reminder that even though Egypt is the first Arab state to normalize, the normalization was never really complete. Like it never trickled down to the Egyptian population. The Egyptian people still hate Israel the same way they did when the Camp David Accords were signed. So it wasn't a success in that sense. It wasn't a success in the sense that it never delivered on the promise of economic prosperity that Sadat had hoped it would deliver, of like making Egypt the Singapore or Japan of the Arab world. That never happened. You were only ejected out of the equation. And then the kind of material realities of the accords are also being tested right now, and that there were several breaches of the accords on both sides. And a lot of analysts in Egypt have been saying that the eclipse of the Camp David Accords is happening as we speak, that something else is going to be ushered in its place. And it speaks to the very material reality that even if you bring back Ariel Sharon from the dead and give him Egypt to rule over, that still would not be enough for the Israelis because of the histories and the realities. Like Egypt and Israel will continue to be existential threats to each other, even if you sign 1,000 normalization accords. They will always have an expiration date.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've been noticing as well that their geopolitical analysts of the region have started talking about how the relationship between Israel and Egypt could be changing within the next couple of years. This is not a sort of
like Israel could never have asked for a more favorable Egyptian regime,
right?
And it still finds
not enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I think is, when you said earlier, I really feel that is the case, that a lot of things are being clarified and having to be confronted that had been ignored or covered over. They've been made much more apparent. And the bombing of Qatar, for example, the changing relationship, as you're pointing out, between Israel and Egypt, the stresses on that, show and suggest that there is, no choice in some sense but resistance. So you're going to be forced into resistance. It's just, do you choose the time and the manner in which you will resist? Will you wait until it's too late and you've been kind of lost any possibility of collective regional cooperation in ending imperialism and settler colonialism in the region? Or, are you going to band together and actually confront it? And it seems to me this is the really disturbing question that the Arab political elites who have aligned themselves with the West have to be confronting and considering. On the one hand, they might look and tell you as an object lesson, look what happened in Gaza, look what happened in southern Lebanon, look what happened in Syria. But it's going to happen all over the region. There isn't a regime or a government that is pro-Israeli enough, as long as it has a population, as long as it has people in the region who, have demands for sovereignty and for a better life. Like, that is just not going to be accommodated within this vision. So that's what I think. You had another this is a good segue to an article that I did want to mention, and it's from, I believe, before October 7th, but you already had framed this everyday under this title, "Everyday Resistance is Not an Alternative to Politics." And I see that as, again, a kind of similar necessary realization that things are being clarified. You were already suggesting it, but post October 7th, I mean, that's the question. What is politics, in post October 7th in the Arab world, other than clarifying the necessity of resistance? I'm wondering what you think about that, what you were arguing with in that piece. And now that it's after October 7th, do you have any other reflections on thoughts on it from that time?
So I have people I know in Egypt, or friends in Egypt, whose ideal vision of Egypt, or who thought the way it should be going towards, and that is prior to October 7th, is that they took the model of Scandinavian countries of social democracy as something to aspire to. This is the thing that we want. There's some political parties that think that in Egypt. And with October 7th and what's happening, if you hadn't already known this before, but that is really not an option for the countries in the region. As long as imperialism exists and Israel exists in the region, you can't just you're not even allowed to, even prior to the state of Israel, there was this really interesting project. There's a book in Arabic that covers it. There was this Egyptian capitalist in the 20s called Talat Harb.
Yes.
And under the British, he had a project. He was sick of, the Egyptian bourgeois class not being able to accumulate enough capital under British colonial rule. So he had this project of national capitalism, and he created Bank Nasser, which still exists until today, with the rules of having only Egyptian shareholders. And from Bank Nasser, there was created a lot of the national industries that then Nasser took towards the path of state capitalism. A lot of the public companies were created from then. But then what happened was that the Brits saw even this project as a threat to British and French interests in the country, and as Egypt deviating from its role of just being, supplying cotton, or, being the global supply chain of what Britain wanted it to be. So it used its colonial administrators and its military to quash this project completely. So this goes back to what Samir Amin was talking about when he was talking about delinking, and that countries of the global south, and specifically in the region, are not even allowed to do the first step of becoming capitalist or industrializing, because that in and of itself threatens its status as periphery countries that are going out of the order placed to it, but it was placed in by global capital. So we go from this moment until now, and we see where Egypt is economically under the the mercy of the IMF, the World Bank, loans from the Gulf, the majority of Egyptian land in Cairo owned by the UAE or UAE proxies. And you see how this sovereignty is eroded even further and further. And this is where, when you think about our region, unfortunately, you can't just think that we can achieve, like our socialism, or our left can take the same path as how it has taken here in the global north, or in the belly of the beast, because we have the primary contradiction to deal with first, which is imperialism in the region. And some people think it's sloganeering. Some people think it's whitewashing, dictatorship. But this is the main question that we have to deal with, or at most they have to be dealt with at the same time. But you can't relegate the question of sovereignty and the question of dealing with imperialism and deal with secondary questions first.
Interesting point. I really agree with that. Before we're getting close to our 90 minutes, which we know all football matches, they might have a little extra time, but they go 90 minutes. So we're coming close to the end. But I did want to remind people before I ask you a final question, and for you to tell readers and listeners how to keep up and follow your work, is just to, if you're watching and you haven't liked the stream, what are you doing? Go like the stream. I mean, it really doesn't cost you anything to do that. It's very easy. Just move the mouse over and the cursor and click. And then other people, even if they can't join us late here at the end, it'll come on their feeds and they'll see this and they'll have a chance to listen to this really excellent analysis. So like the stream, share it, on your social media accounts, and do subscribe to the channel so that you will be aware of future and upcoming live streams. Office Hours returns to Fridays this week. I'll be doing a solo show. I won't have a guest for the first time. I'm just going to do a solo show, and we'll be talking why history, how history, studying the past for a just future. I think we've actually heard a few things in the history of Egypt that Nihal's been sharing with us that are exactly perfect examples, really, of why we need to understand history in order to really imagine and work toward a just and equitable future. So do tune in. But okay, I wanted to come back to a question that David Schmid posed earlier as a kind of different frame, perhaps. And of course, he also said that he was going to log off if I, said that I was an Arsenal fan. So I'm not going to say that I'm an Arsenal fan. I will not mention Arsenal at all in this broadcast, other than to say I'm not going to mention it. But he asked, is there a place for left-wing mourning as opposed to melancholia in either the Arab context or more generally? So coming back to the very beginning of this conversation where you talked about left-wing melancholia, kind of what to do with the sense of defeat and the derailing of normal politics as a result of defeat and repression. And as we were talking about, I think uncovering that defeat really wasn't a matter of losing a war as long as you were resisting. It really came about much more. What was much more devastating to people's morale, their psychology, was in fact actually the surrender of the cause for justice through the Camp David peace accords. But what would you say to this? What do you think is the place of mourning that might be distinguished from melancholia? And I kind of have in mind a little bit, the fact that we just passed the anniversary death date of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. But how would you answer David Schmid's question?
I feel like because of, Lenin never really considered with this quote that is attributed to him about decades where things don't happen, weeks where decades happen, the events of the region and how they keep happening to us. And I think mourning is occurring, but mourning really needs you need space to mourn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of continuation of history and continuation of historical events, and um, the different ways in which things have rapidly changed in the region really make it so that mourning like is never really processed. Like even when we think about this, which is brings me back to these like unfinished projects, when we mourn Nasser or Nasserism, or when we mourn Nasrallah, we're not really mourning the person, but the project that they fought for, and it's also nostalgia to the past, and I'm not like, even if we think about what's happening in Gaza right now, like the genocide hasn't ended as well. Like the genocide just keeps going. Like it's the longest. People never thought, like even the best analysts, like everyone got it wrong. People always said, Israel always finishes its wars quickly. It never lasts as long. But it's kind of like thrust us into this new reality of unspeakable horror, the worst mass atrocity of the 21st century, and the worst televised horrors we've ever seen in our life, to usher for this new era, which is what we talked about, of brute force, an era of like, even like it's clear that the US and its proxy Israel don't want partners or allies in the region. They want subjects. They want like even the partners who play nicely. Even Qatar was bombed, and it just shows that you have to submit, and it has to be humiliating, and it's an era of brute force, and we don't even care about the thousands of people. We don't even care about public opinion anymore. Even if there was a pretense of caring about public opinion back in the day, it does not matter anymore. The choice you have is between the um, the stick and the bullet. The carrot is not an option anymore. So in these conditions, I think um, there's no real space for mourning, um, like there's no space for it. I don't know what you think, Adnan.
Well,
I
I mean, it's an interesting conundrum, because you were saying, like there's a lot of this affect theory, in academia, but
Yeah.
like a materialist analysis of it, I think when you said that it's not really mourning for the person we've lost, but more for the possibility that the cause itself, the movement itself, might be lost. And that's what's so disturbing and distressing, but it's also an opportunity for defiance. Look at how many hundreds of thousands of people came to the streets to say, I mean, they did that when General Qasem Soleimani was murdered, assassinated by
US.
Trump
Yeah.
administration. So there's mourning that is like withdrawing and sadness and feeling for the loss in order to move on. And maybe there is something productive in these kinds of memories if it's combined with a sense of defiance rather than, I don't know, just of defeat, of like, can you be, I mean, the Palestinians, I don't know. I mean, this, as you said, it's 2 years. It's impossible to have imagined. It's impossible to have imagined not just that Israel would continue a war and not be restrained for such a long period and prevented from continuing, but it's even more astonishing and even more important to remember no one would have thought the Palestinians of Gaza would continue to resist. Even over the weekend, there were resistance operations taking place. We see the videos, we see, physical evidence that there is still a defiant resistance. This is impossible to have imagined, I think, 3 years ago, to think that this could happen. So I don't know. I think we're wrestling with it. David writes in, and he's a scholar of English literature, and hopefully will be. He's agreed to come. He works on horror fiction, zombies, and others. He's agreed to come on Halloween for office hours. It turns out the 31st is a Friday, so we'll be talking more about these things. But he says, in Mourning, it is the world. He's quoting Freud. In Mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In Melancholia, it is the ego itself. So I think that distinction is an important one.
Yeah.
And I think we get that also from Nouri Ghana's book on Arab melancholia, about distinguishing between productive political affect that comes from melancholia rather than, I mean, he's wanting to say there's a difference between a certain kind of melancholia and a more debilitating retrograde one, which is really what Freud is talking about there.
Yeah, I mean,
you think
in the Arab world, which is like the crux of Nouri Ghana's book, but what I'm also saying, I'm not saying Nouri Ghana is saying this. I'm saying this as the kind of like crude materialist that I am. But I'm gonna borrow from a contemporary like Egyptian Marxist called Muhammad Naim, who has a YouTube channel that I really recommend to people who can speak Arabic. It's been really useful. But he says he places this tragedy and this affect. He said the tragedy of Israel is not in the atrocities that it causes in the region, it commits in the region. The tragedy of Israel is its mere existence for us. And what causes the melancholia, what causes the defeat, and I'm talking here in the psychological sense, not in the material sense, but in the material and psychological sense, is, and I'm talking specifically about Egypt, but it's the inability to find a decisive solution for the problem of Israel until now. Like with everything that's happened, and he says this specifically, he says the presence of Israel on our borders, the inability to decide this question, and that's, I think, what made the 67 defeat so potent. This has affected our confidence on every level. It's as if the existence of Israel is proof of our unworthiness and our defeat in other sectors. And that's the core question. And I think, when we talk about, when Ghassan Kanafani says something like there is no non-Arab way out, or when I mention that the Arab dimension is still important despite its weakness, I mention it because this is specifically an Arab in that sense, because some people get upset and they say like Arabs are oppressive to minorities, etc., etc. Arab in that sense is a political category rather than an ethnic or a racial one. It's everyone who lives in the region who is affected by this and who is part of this liberation project. And there is already a regressive Arabism, a reactionary Arabism. Just as the Arab Spring was Arab, the counter-revolution was spearheaded by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There is Arab security coordination. There is Arab regressive media coordination. So it exists already. So in its existence, there creates a class of people who are affected negatively by that. So what we've done in recent years is, the Arabs have retreated, and under the guise of empowering the Palestinians, saying, oh, Palestinians should lead this fight. The Arabs have failed. You carry the torch to liberate your own self. Is in that we've made a problem that affects every single country in the region, especially the countries on the border, especially a country as big as Egypt, like as huge as Egypt, who, by the way, like early British documents say that the Brits agreed for Zionist colonization to happen because it stops Egypt from becoming a big country. Like some people argue that Israel was put in the region to stop Egypt from being the biggest country in the region and to stop the Levant from uniting. Like Palestinians are its victims, but it's there for us, actually. But we've given the torch to Palestinians to carry the struggle forward on themselves, and in my opinion, carry a huge burden that is beyond any one nation to carry, and calling them a nation of giants, a nation of steadfast people, which is all true, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's our problem. It's a collective problem, and you're using language that empowers, that on the surface empowers Palestinians, and using identity politics to basically make Palestinians carry this huge burden on them by themselves, and to which Gazans are now paying the heaviest price for, whether they know it or not. But they're fighting a fight for all of us. Yeah.
So well said. I want to thank you, Nihal, for spending time late on a Monday night. You're 5 hours ahead of me, so you've been amazing to keep such coherent thoughts and insightful and incisive analysis late into the evening. And I'm sure my audience really appreciates it. And so I'd like you maybe just to tell people how they can find more of your work and follow. You've mentioned a couple of projects that are underway. How can people stay in touch with the work that you're doing? Where can they listen to Nile to Bank and also read your work?
Yeah, so I should really create a website. I haven't
You
done
should.
so, or a link tree or anything. But you can follow me on Twitter. I'm not sure if you can post the handle at Nihilist. And you can follow me at Instagram, Nihal Aasar. If you could, put the handles in Adnan, then people can follow me there.
I will
And
definitely put those links in the handles. Yeah.
yeah, and my show is on nts.live. It's archived under, all of the episodes are archived under Nile to Bank.
Yeah, do listen to them. I mean, it's a little too hip and cool for me, but I think maybe some of you folks out there will really enjoy it. I mean, I love the music, but I was like, okay, this is really not my scene. This is, for people much younger than me. But I love it. So I just wanted to, I had so much to talk about with you. We could have gone on so much further. I hope you'll come back again in the future.
Definitely. Happy to come back. Yeah.
And we'll have to have you on a struggle session live stream too. And I have to say that the other guests, sure, they like to, talk with me and with one another, but people were really disappointed that the British Rail has eroded to such an extent that you weren't able to come home on a Sunday in time. Because they wanted to talk, as I said, with the really cool one here.
I'll come to the next one. I was really excited as well.
Yes, well, we will do that.
Okay.
I just want to thank everybody who's been watching and commenting. There's been a really great discussion in the chat, and so many, returnees. Is becoming a really wonderful community for support, discussion, and analysis. People like Alexander Luchte, Ode to John Trudell, of course, David Schmid. Resistance is Fertile was in the house. Verena Fraser, Joe Umami, Ann Lee, Danny Ferguson, like so many people who are repeat listeners and repeat offenders, I guess you could say. They keep coming back to the kind of great discussions in radical politics that we've been having here. And so I just want to encourage you to like the stream, share it, subscribe, and also attend tomorrow's fundraiser. It's going to be a great discussion. Nick Estes from Red Nation, Jared Ball from Black Liberation Media and I Mix What I Like, Renee from Renee's on Saturdays from Black Liberation Media as well. East Sina from East as a Podcast will be there. Resistance is Fertile will be there. Benji and Sasha both. And of course, last but not least, co-organizing with me, Jay from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, which is, of course, a show that I know Nihal has been a guest on as well. So it should be a really great discussion and a chance to express some solidarity. Let's break the siege of complicity and raise a lot of money for a really important Palestinian mutual aid organization doing incredible work that's so needed at this vital time, the Samir Project. That's 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Hope to see you then. Until next time, until then, and until Friday office hours, salam and solidarity, peace, but with only with justice.
Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.